We can hang up on the Skype. I'm going to hang up Skype.
Turn.
Yeah, you don't have to be live. I'm not going to be live. I'm just going to use the cover of your book, and we're going to discuss it. So I'm just going to get started now. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. Tonight we have a very special guest who published a recent book titled Hillary and Vince, The Story of Love, Death, and Cover-Up. Dean Arnold, are you there?
I'm right here.
Awesome. Dean, thank you very much for being on the show. I read your book last night. I read the whole thing. I really enjoyed it. It was had a lot of personal relevance to me. And before we get started talking about the subject, please tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a freelance author, writer, documentarian, and so I've various subjects over the years. It tends to mostly be history and biography, but I've also dealt into some investigation, and of course this book is kind of a thriller investigative reporting, and also kind of dabble in what some people would call conspiracy theory. I like to call it corruption theory. And so, yeah, that's what I've done over the years.
Great. Well, tell me, why did you pick up this subject about Hillary and Vince Foster?
I was kind of a Republican conservative activist when I was a young man, and which was 93. I'd have been about 23, 24 years old. I was working at a think tank here in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and I was following a lot of the Vince Foster thing when it first happened. I think I was early on following Mike Rivero's What Really Happened website. He was on it pretty quick.
Yeah.
And
it used to be called Rancho Runamucca. Do you remember that name?
No, I did not know that. That's funny. But
I read that too.
Gotcha. Okay. So I was watching the Senate banking hearings. They spent a day doing whitewater hearings. And they spent, or I guess they did whitewater hearings, and a portion of the day or the entire day they dealt with Vince Foster. And at some point in time, they brought up the coroner, Dr. James Beyer.
Right. And
it was the perfunctory senators just kind of saying political stuff and nobody really getting to the issue, except for one guy, Louch Faircloth from North Carolina. And he came, Louch Faircloth started asking some pretty tough questions. And he said, you know, Dr. Beyer, you marked on your coroner's report that you took x-rays. But now you're testifying that you didn't take x-rays. Did you take x-rays or didn't you take x-rays? And he says, I didn't take any x-rays. He says, well, why didn't you take any x-rays? And he said, well, it's because the machine broke. He said, well, you know, the park police say in their reports that you told them that you took x-rays and you told them the results of the x-rays, that there was no bullet fragments. He says, how in the world could the park police give reports that you took an x-ray if you didn't take an x-ray? He says, well, I just don't have any explanation. And, you know, it was, you know, and they kept asking the questions. Why didn't you, you know, bring in another copy machine from, an x-ray machine from another hospital? Why didn't you get your x-ray machine fixed? I mean, it was just, you know, it was absurd. And I thought it was the big smoking gun that would sort of blow the whole case open.
Interesting.
And I'd happened to tape it on a VHS recorder, I think. And so in Chattanooga, we've got kind of a conservative paper. We did back in the day, conservative, Republican, you know, Bible verses on the editorial page, you know, everything you could ask for.
Real Bible Belt stuff.
Yeah. So I took this portion of the hearings to show this guy. I was like, man, he's going to freak out. And he watched it and just sort of nodded his head and smiled and said, thank you. And that was it. So I just thought, I was just like, how in the world can people not get up in arms about this? Why do, you know, it seems like someone like him would blast it on the front page, but there just wasn't an interest, and I just couldn't figure that out. It saddened me and it confused me, but it also made me quite determined to do more about it.
Uh-huh.
It wasn't until years later that I was in between writing books and looking for my next gig, my next project, and I was in the Annapolis, Maryland area, and a friend of mine from college who I was meeting with, he said that he happened to be friends with the guy who was working real closely with Patrick Knowlton, who was one of the key witnesses in the Foster case. Right. And I was like, really? You know the guy? Yeah. He says, man, I'd love to meet those guys. I'd read about Patrick Knowlton over the years and thought he was quite a hero and really admired what he'd done. Real quickly, he was probably the first eyewitness on the case, the first real one.
And can you just kind of retell for the audience who isn't familiar with the death of Vince Foster, just the kind of timeline of what happened to him, where it happened, and
good point. Yeah, good point. You can't take anything for granted. Bill and Hillary Clinton came into the White House in 1993, and within 6 months, it became top of the news that their friend and lawyer from Little Rock, Arkansas, that had come to the White House with him was found dead just outside the White House in a place called Fort Marcy Park. He was dead by gunshot, and he was one of the closest friends of the Clintons and was the kind of the keeper of all the personal stuff, their personal assets, follow the money, that whole
kind of like their consigliere, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, sure. Yeah. And it was immediately ruled a suicide. You know how the media does. They immediately make their verdicts on whatever it is they're trying to push you towards. So it was immediately determined that it was a suicide. But there was lots of weird stuff that was happening, that was being reported at the same time that made you raise your eyebrow. So that's who Vince Foster is. Gotcha. It was the highest ranking death of someone in the government under suspicious circumstances since JFK.
Yeah, it's a remarkable, and he was an attorney. He's a high-powered attorney. I think he went to Vanderbilt, right?
I don't know. I forgot his college, but he was deputy White House counsel, right. And he worked with Bernie Nussbaum, who was the White House counsel.
And Fort Marcy Park got its name because it was an old Civil War fort that is west of downtown D.C. up the kind of parkway in Northern Virginia.
Yeah, it's right there next to everything in D.C. It's just it's just a couple of miles from everything, so it's just right there.
Gotcha. And so then getting back to your story, so you met one of Knowlton's, you met Knowlton's attorney, was it John Clark?
No, I met Hugh Turley.
Hugh Turley, okay. And Hugh Turley was one of the early people who investigated the case. He lived in D.C., correct?
Right. There's three guys. Let me get back to Patrick Knowlton real quick so people are familiar. Patrick Knowlton just was on his way from one place to another doing a little construction job at a cabin, and he needed to take a leak, and he just got off about 4:30 off the parkway and went to this place he wasn't really that familiar with, Fort Marcy Park, just went in there to find a place to go take a leak. And as he drove up and pulled in the parking lot, he pulled up next to a couple of cars, and one of the guys in the car kind of gets out and starts peering at him and giving him this look like, I'm going to, get the hell out of here. What are you doing here? And it freaked him out, and he normally would have just turned around and done something else, but he had to go to the bathroom. So he got out and kind of warily went over to a tree and did his thing and came back, and he looked in one of the cars that the guy wasn't in and kind of saw a couple of things, and he saw that it had Arkansas tags. He saw that it was an early 80s light tan Honda Accord, and that was it. He left. Well, that night he found out that Vince Foster had been killed in that park about the time he was there. And he felt the need to call the park police and tell them about this very strange character that he saw there. Of course, they didn't seem to care, and nobody ever got back with him. Then what happened was about 9 months to a year later, he got a call from one of the top reporters in England, Ambrose Evans Pritchard with the London Daily Telegraph, who blasted Patrick Knowlton's story across their worldwide newspaper, which caused Patrick to finally get subpoenaed by the grand jury to tell his story.
And just to let the audience know, Evans Ambrose Pritchard at the time was probably one of the few journalists who really looked into a lot of the Clinton shenanigans from a very objective point.
Oh, yeah.
And, he was actually, I was in D.C. at that time. from 95 to 96. That people that I knew and people at law school with me always referred to him as kind of really telling very trenchant observations that some of the other journalists were not. So
yeah, he's got a great book called The Secret Life of Bill Clinton, which is one of the greats. It's a great book.
yeah, he's a great writer. And so Ambrose Evans Pritchard reached out to Patrick Knowlton, correct?
Correct. And so that kind of blew things open for Patrick Knowlton, and he ended up testifying in front of the grand jury. His Peugeot got bashed in by a guy the day he went to testify. He had like 25 FBI agents follow him one day, him and his girlfriend, while they took a walk. And he started getting harassed, and strange things started to happen, and he ended up filing a lawsuit against the FBI. It went to the Supreme Court.
Right. And how did he find his lawyer? Didn't he run into John Clark at his apartment or something?
Yeah,
like that?
they were both bachelors, and so they're doing laundry, at some laundromat or at the bottom of the apartment complex or something. And so they just struck up a friendship. He had I think an issue with parking tickets or something. He needed speeding tickets. He asked John for help, and John couldn't help him. Maybe it was an insurance matter, but John said he was a criminal attorney. But then when this case came up, John Clark said he could help him, and ended up being a great colleague for him. So he and John Clark, the attorney, Patrick Knowlton, the witness, and Hugh Turley, who's a crack researcher. My book basically takes that trio, and that's what kind of weaves the book through. They become the protagonists, kind of the heroes of the book, and it's kind of them against the world, David and Goliath. And they start going to the National Archives and uncovering documents, and they get power discovery because of the lawsuit, and start interviewing people, and they begin to garner a whole bunch of evidence that nobody would know were it not for these guys. So they kind of take on the whole federal beast, and it's a fascinating story.
And I mean,
so that's how I got into it.
Well, I was just going to say, like, they had distinctly different impressions of the facts than the government and the Fisk report, which preceded the Starr report, and that was really what made them different than what the government's position was. Is that correct?
Well, yeah. And, if you read my book, and this is just true a lot in life, people get sort of overwhelmed by, when, quote unquote, the government is coming out and giving this official story. They just think, how could we, consider thinking differently, or thinking that we've got the truth and the quote unquote the government doesn't. But when you look into a case like this Vince Foster case that I wrote a book about, at the end of the day, there's like 2 or 3 FBI agents that kind of are involved in every investigation. They were there with the Park Police at the beginning. They were the main ones handling the Fisk report. They were the main ones handling the Starr report. And so it's really just a few guys that do this cover-up and do this corruption and this criminal activity that causes a murder to get covered up. So Patrick and Hugh and John Clark were, uncovering some of this evidence, and it was pretty obvious and pretty clear that the official government story, quote unquote, was chock full of holes and is not the right story. But it wasn't just those guys. The lead prosecutor for the Starr investigation was uncovering the same evidence. And
his name was Miguel Rodriguez, correct?
Miguel Rodriguez. And we've got a 30-page memo for him now that he wrote back when this was happening, laying out reams and reams and reams of documentation of evidence of why he believed Vince Foster did not commit suicide, but was murdered.
And wasn't he pressured to kind of toe the government line as a government employee and everything?
Yeah, they threw chairs around in his office. They threatened his personal life. They basically threatened to expose the fact that he was gay. So it was personal blackmail, physical threatening, and after a few months of that, he finally cracked. But he wrote a 30-page memo talking about the gun that was 3 different types of guns were identified. When the first witness that got there didn't see any gun at all. He talked about how the body had been moved several times, how the park police had staged the corpse. He talked about Vince Foster having semen on his shorts. No one had looked into that. There were blonde hairs on Foster's body that were never identified. They never tried to identify him. There was one fingerprint on the gun, no other fingerprints anywhere on the gun. So the gun was wiped clean. But the one fingerprint they did find on the underside of the gun was never even checked to see whose it was. There were fingerprints on the alleged car of Vince Foster that were never checked or run for identification. Just
weren't there rug fibers on his body as well, in addition to the blonde?
Yeah. Rodriguez doesn't talk about that, but that's been talked about. But just lots of just hardcore forensic evidence that just was never pursued and never followed. So Miguel Rodriguez, he started calling witnesses to the grand jury, primarily park police officers, and started to crack the case. One of the park police officers kind of broke down and admitted that the crime scene had been altered. And at that point, the number 2 and number 3 guy under Ken Starr in the Ken Starr investigation, the Office of Independent Counsel, which is like, they have like 200 staffers, but the number 2 and the number 3 guy were real high-powered political dudes, and they basically cornered Miguel Rodriguez, the lead prosecutor, and said, "You will stop." And they forbade him from calling any more grand juries, so he didn't have the ability to continue his investigation. So once that happened,
did he resign? He resigned and just basically left, right? Left government and traveled to California or something like that.
Yeah, he resigned, went back to California. And just got away from it all. He did, he wrote this 30-page memo for posterity, and it's a good thing that he did, because it took a few years, but Knowlton and Hugh Turley, finally found it in the National Archives. But he started this long memo and said, "Hey, this is all that's here. This is all that's going on. We need to pursue this." And Ken Starr refused to pursue it. What's going on with Ken Starr, I don't know, but I think something's not right for sure.
I mean, it was the Fisk and Starr reports there were biases there. I mean, if you look through them, they clearly were ignoring certain facts and towing a certain line, at least in my opinion. I haven't read those in 20 years. But
yeah, that's awfully generous to say they just sort of had biases. It's out and out fraud. Yeah. It's out and out just lies. The FBI, they'd interview the medical examiner, and he'd say, "Yeah, in the parking lot was an orange compact car." Well, that's what Knowlton saw, a light tan, small car. And the problem is, the car that they say was in the parking lot was a late 80s gray Honda, which is what Foster owned. But that car was not in the parking lot. And so if Foster's car is not in the parking lot, the whole theory breaks down, because he can't go commit suicide in that park if he doesn't drive over there.
Right. So
the medical examiner says, "Yeah, I didn't see that car, but I saw a small orange compact." Well, they left that out of his FBI report. Well, people like Knowlton say, I didn't see a gray Honda, and they'll put that in his, they'll just kind of they'll take stuff and put it into people's FBI reports and say that that's what they said when they didn't, and things people did said they'd leave out. So there was just a lot of out and out fraud. They did that with the gun. They put words in Vince Foster's wife's mouth that she called a certain gun silver, but it was actually black, and she said it was black. I mean, so to just say it's a bias is way too generous.
Okay, well, thanks for that. I mean, and just kind of go back and talk about Hillary and Vince's relationship. I mean, they had a Hillary and Bill's relationship is very strange, but Hillary and Vince had things going on that showed that they had a deeper relationship. Is that correct?
Well, yeah. Well, they were lovers. They had an affair. And beyond that, I'll get back to that in a second. But beyond that, Vince Foster was the keeper of the secrets. He had all the Whitewater papers and all the. He was charged to put their assets in a blind trust. And he also worked with Hillary to track all of Bill's women, all the affairs Bill was having, and she would get Vince to hire private investigators to monitor them and track them, often intimidate them and threaten them. And so Vince was involved in all that dirty business. But I've got 5 different witnesses in my book who talk about Hillary and Vince's affair. One's a doctor who said everybody knew that about Hillary and Vince and their affair. There was a couple of bodyguards who said that whenever Bill went out of town, Vince would show up at the governor's mansion like right away. They took Hillary and Vince to a cabin out in the woods. There's another bodyguard named L.D. Brown who witnessed them, as he put it crassly, sticking tongues down each other's throats. And he said that Hillary one time told him, sometimes you got to do things you got to do to make, outside of your marriage to get what you need.
Interesting. Do you know if their relationship was, they were still kind of having an affair up until the time of his death?
I don't know the answer to that.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a curious point. But so this is Vince Foster, a close associate of the family, has all their legal documents, and then turns up dead 6 months after being in Washington, D.C. It's just a remarkable story. Just to let you know, my association with John Clark and Patrick Knowlton is that I've met them personally 20 years ago as a law student when I was in D.C. I actually answered a ad at my law school for an intern, and I actually worked with John Clark. So during that time, the summer of 1996, almost 20 years ago, I used to hang out with him. I actually did a lot of work with John Clark. I didn't know at the time, but what they really wanted was somebody to deliver their findings to Congress. And so me and John sat down at a table in his old offices, which were close to Chinatown, and actually folded and made all of these documents to be delivered to Congress and the Senate. And guess who got to do the delivery? It was me.
Yeah.
So I actually walked through all the houses of Congress and all of the senatorial offices and just dropped these off at the front, or tried to hand them to people. I actually ran into Senator Levin, who was the senator from Michigan. I handed it directly to him. I walked into Arlen Specter's office. I mean, all these people. Arlen Specter had a very remarkable office in the sense that he had pictures from ceiling to floor, and of all of his shaking hands. And this is the guy who came up with the magic bullet theory and the Kennedy assassination.
Yeah.
All those guys. So I walked through and did all that with John, and me and John would hang out. John didn't have a car at the time, so he and I lived on the northern part of Virginia, and he lived kind of close to Foggy Bottom. So we would go from his office, take the metro back home, and John would get off first, and then I would just go on down to Virginia. So I can verify all of the stories are correct, that these guys are really beyond reproach, and that they had integrity. The stories really are true. Everything that Knowlton went through, and Clark was really a great guy, a great boss, and I can just vouch for it firsthand. I also endured some kind of similar things as Knowlton. They wanted to take a look at me too, the FBI and stuff like that. So I remember going places and people taking my picture, and I saw all the pictures that Knowlton had of these kind of young, well-shaven guys, these kind of like younger guys holding black satchels and stuff like that, following Knowlton around. So I saw the pictures of that, and I met Knowlton firsthand. I met him face to face. We went out to dinner once or twice, and it's just interesting. I actually walked out to Fort Marcy Park and stood exactly over the berm where Vince Foster was dumped, and I was like, no way. There's no way. This doesn't look like a place that somebody would go and commit suicide. It looks like a place that's secretive and as forested, where somebody would be dumped. So I never really believed it once I started researching it, and this was like 3 years after it happened, 1996. But everybody in DC at that time was very well aware of the Vince Foster story, but they were also aware of like the Clinton body count. And everybody in DC talked about Mena, Arkansas, and all these associations with Dan Laster that you talk about in your book.
Right.
And there's a bunch of people that fell off, like jumped off of apartment buildings, that were found dead in cars. So, you know, the time in DC when I was there for 3 years, and I've actually shook Bill Clinton's hand twice. I know people who worked with all of these different higher end people, you know. I know, yeah. So it was very interesting being in DC. I'll just leave it at that. But I know the Vince Foster story, and I followed Mike Rivero's information too, and that's another guy who got harassed. I mean, for saying that he thought that Vince Foster was murdered. He actually endured harassment. A lot of people did. So anyway,
Yeah,
that's just my part of that story.
Yeah.
And so I mean, it's really a fascinating story. There. And what do you think, like, as far as like Vince Foster, what do you think was the cause of how it happened or why it happened?
Well, that's an open-ended question, and I don't think anybody has a real strong grasp on the answer to the question. In my book, I propose 3 different reasons why Vince Foster may have been killed, and one of them has to do with
before you say that, wasn't he, after he was disappeared, didn't they find like a ripped up suicide note? And didn't Nussbaum go through Vince Foster's office and take papers? I mean, there was a consistent kind of element within the Clintons of destroying papers. And the interesting thing is that I just read within the last week or so that Vince Foster's documents that were in either the National Archives or some other building were disappeared. Did you read that?
Whose papers? Bill Clinton's papers were disappeared?
No, it was Vince Foster's.
Vince Foster's papers were disappeared. I didn't see that, but some stuff crops up here and there about Foster. Well, you know,
here it is: exclusive, missing FBI files linking Hillary Clinton to the suicide of White House counsel Vince Foster have vanished from the National Archives.
Oh yeah, I did see that. You know,
mail thing from August 23rd. So it's
that's Jim Clement. Jim Clement, the FBI agent, and another guy. They've come out a couple times in the last couple of months with some stories like that, which to me looks suspiciously like disinfo, disinformation, because they're trying to reinforce the idea that Foster was a suicide. Gotcha. So they kind of reveal some interesting, juicy things like, oh, there's some missing documents, but at the end of the day, the story is saying that Vince Foster was a suicide.
Gotcha. I didn't get that. Here it is, the article, if you can see it on the screen.
Yeah, no, I've read that. And actually, when the first article came out from those guys, I actually included it in my book. And then I talked to Hugh Turley, and he set me straight, because these guys are really putting out disinformation.
Interesting. There's actually another disinfo writer who, I can't remember what her name is, but she put out a book that talks about Vince Foster, and she goes through all the facts and then says, oh, he committed suicide. So it's clear that there's enough power out there to, there's Clemente.
Yeah.
There's enough power out there to actually write books that are disinfo.
Yeah, and I think Christopher Reddy, you got to kind of look at with a raised eyebrow too. He's a strange one. Why
do you say that?
Well, he focuses a lot on the body being moved, on the fibers and that sort of thing. I'm not sure that's a very helpful direction to go. He's got some strange connections with the heads of the FBI. Several of the heads of the FBI seem to have very close access to them, almost like he could have been working as a double agent.
Interesting. Wouldn't surprise me at all. He just put out a book recently, another follow-up to it. Are you familiar with that?
No, I'm not.
Yeah, let me see if I can find it. It came out, Strange Death of Vince Foster, an investigation. I don't know, maybe it was just a rehash of an older book. But, yeah, I guess it was. I think it was.
Well, the tack I took with the book was not to try to identify who killed Foster or why he was killed, but to lay out the preponderance of evidence that he undoubtedly was killed. And then to say if Hillary was his best friend and his lover, and all this myriad of evidence and documentation of a cover-up of his death and murder is right there for everyone to see, why has Hillary Clinton said nothing? What kind of friend is this person? What kind of colleague is this person to let her close friend and lover be murdered and there be a huge organized cover-up and her to say nothing about it? And that's the tact I take, because that's really, you can't really argue against it. And you don't want a person like that as president of the United States. So that's the clear-cut kind of thesis of my book. And in terms of who killed him and why he was killed, there's some places you can look, and there's some interesting theories, but I don't think anything has been conclusively put together yet.
Have you ever heard the theory that there was a kind of like bachelor pad at an apartment in DC that was actually very common for a lot of upper level guys, a place to go to and drink, that he was lured there and that's where the murder took place?
Yeah, I've heard that, and it could be. It doesn't really help explain why.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I always thought that he was a straight arrow, and that was an anathema to being a politician with the Clintons, you know? And there was a lot of whitewater stuff that was going on there, and he might have wanted to come clean with it, and somebody insider said, no way. Had you heard that?
Yeah, that's a tougher one for me to believe. I think you have to say that if he was the Clintons' quote-unquote consigliere, and you look at what they were doing in Little Rock, these guys are gangsters. This is mafia. This is high-level corruption. And so I don't think you can position Vince Foster as a straight arrow. I think you have to look at him as a gangster and a corrupt person, which makes it difficult to piece together a theory as to why he would, was he killed because he was going to blow the whistle, and so he got killed before he did blow the whistle. Well, if he was that corrupt, it'd be hard to think of a scenario that would cause him to blow the whistle.
Right. Good point.
So one of the things that Hugh and I have sort of been looking at we're talking about the last couple of months is there was a very strange document that they found in the National Archives that said that referred to the Vince Foster case and talked about child abduction and kidnapping.
Interesting.
And
was it in relation to the Finders? Is that right?
No. I've had a show or two about it where the Finders have come up, but no, it was just the cover to a report, and the report itself was not in the National Archives, and it looks fairly clear that whoever put it in the National Archives probably made a mistake. Probably wasn't supposed to go in there.
Interesting.
But for me, it's going to take something really kind of way out there like that to cause somebody like Foster to want to blow the whistle. I mean, if you're a gangster of the first degree and you're doing financial fraud all the time, you're not going to blow the whistle one day just because suddenly you get a conscience.
Interesting.
But if you find yourself getting thicker and thicker into it, and then all of a sudden you find yourself dealing with pedophiles and people who abduct children and kill children, that could be enough for someone to one day just say, you know what, I've got to speak out about this, and I'm resigning, and I can't do it anymore, or whatever it is that he said. And that could have been enough to get him killed.
Interesting. Didn't Webster Hubbell come out and say that if anybody thinks it was a suicide, it's wrong? Or didn't Webb Hubbell, one of their old friends from Arkansas, say something like that? Yeah, he sure did. So I'm not sure what that's about, because Hubbell's a gangster too. But that makes me wonder if someone outside the Clinton circle killed him. Hubbell and a couple others were leaning heavily on Foster the last 2 or 3 days of his life, trying to get him to do something. And there's a funny, I think it's funny, editorial in a Wall Street Journal
around that same time, talking about Hubble, how he had just had a broken arm. His arm was in a sling. So I think somebody might have been leaning on Hubble as well.
Interesting. And didn't they all travel to the like the Delaware Shore or something like that?
Yeah, there was an estate
the days before.
Yeah, there's a mafia guy named Nathan Landau, and it was his estate. He was a big Democrat contributor, so they were all there for 2 or 3 days, and
that made it sealed his fate, huh? Like something went on there. They had a secret discussion, and then somebody made the decision that Foster had to go.
Yeah, he wasn't saying the right thing, and people would come to his office his final day or the day before and say, are you sure? Are you sure you're sticking with your decision here? What do you want me to tell Bill? When I talked to Bill, it's a lot of veiled kind of conversation like that. The day he died or the day before.
And wasn't there? They were right. When was Waco? Waco had just happened, isn't that correct? And so
yeah, Waco had just happened.
The OK for Waco took place, and it's tied to the mass murder at Waco is tied to even Hillary, isn't that correct?
Hillary was known to be very, very obsessed with what was going on with Waco, and there's phone logs that have been examined that show that Hubble, Foster, and Hillary were constantly on the phone with each other around the Waco events, and also on the phone with Janet Reno. And Foster was writing a memo about Waco on the day he died.
Interesting.
And there was also there was 2 manila envelopes in Bernie Nussbaum's safe, the White House counsel, Foster's boss. And one manila envelope had NSA written on it, and the other one had Waco, eyes only, on it. So there was some secret stuff going on with Waco. That was my first proposed of 3 reasons he was killed. The second one is Foster's connection to all the weapons and drug running and corruption in Arkansas, Mena, Arkansas airport. There's a bodyguard and security officer named Jerry Parks, whose wife testified to Ambrose Evans Pritchard about cocaine and suitcases of cash going back and forth to fund that whole drug running operation. And she went to the grocery store one day just to go buy some groceries. She came out and she opened up the trunk, and the entire trunk of the car was filled with $100 bills. And when she opened the trunk, she could hardly get it closed again because it was so packed with $100 bills. And she was mortified. She went home and she took a pack of the $100 bills and threw them at her husband and said, "What the heck's going on? Are you running drugs?" And her husband told her that Vince Foster had put him up to it. Wow. He was supposed to drive it from Mena to somewhere else, with the drugs and the money or whatever. And so Foster was heavily involved in that whole thing. And perhaps the lid was starting to be uncovered on that. And with Foster's
there were definitely
involvement,
whispers about Mena. Everybody knew, and the amount of money that was coming through there from Barry Seal and all the drugs was astronomical. It was some incredible sum in the billions, really. And I think that Barry Seal was worth $1 billion, like some crazy amount of money. They had so much money they had trouble laundering it, right?
Yeah, and then Terry Reed, who was one of the guys in that whole thing, one of the pilots, he has a firsthand testimony of being in a meeting at Mena, Arkansas with George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Oliver North.
Wow, that's great. That's amazing. It's just amazing history, because before Bill made it to the White House in '93, there was a whole host of murders prior to that event, right?
Right. So that's the second theory that I put in the book in terms of what kind of connections might have led to Foster's death. And the third is just the fact that he was just a Clinton crony, and Clinton cronies tend to get knocked off quite a bit. And he was supposed to have filed their personal assets into a blind trust. Up until that point, every president had done it by inauguration day. But the Clintons had dragged their feet. It had been 6 months. And apparently Foster was refusing to sign the blind asset trust document because he knew whoever signed that document could potentially go to prison.
Gotcha.
So there's speculation that his connection with their personal affairs and their assets and Whitewater and all that kind of stuff was related to his getting killed.
And how do you think that all of these enemies of Clinton are being murdered? I mean, do you think that like somebody like Nichols, who's talked about killing people for the Clintons, or some ex-military people? I mean, it's got to be they have to have some kind of group, right? Is it the Dixie Mafia?
Well, I mean, fortunately, I don't know too much about that underworld, but I guess if you know the right people, then you know how to get things done. And as long as the criminals don't talk, they can keep the game up. Now, I've thought about this, and I've wondered if Foster, because the corruption was just so bad, and and it's just so rife and so obvious, if it had gotten so close to getting exposed that's why Foster was panicking, and that he just may have underestimated just how good the Clintons are at keeping all this stuff, from being exposed. Even if it takes killing a bunch of different people. So I just wonder if that's what happened, is if it was just so obvious that it was all going to come undone, and that's why Foster was buckling.
Right.
But he just underestimated how good they are.
And you talk about in your book how Hillary has that kind of relationship with Bill as kind of like her mind and a fixer, and her idea of always fixing stuff, and that that could be how she came to this conclusion that things had to be done away with and move forward. She could have made that decision too.
Could have been that. Now, because of comments like Webb Hubbell's, and I think there's even a comment in Webb Hubbell's book that Hillary's first comment was that she thought that a Navy SEAL team had taken out Vince Foster. Whether these people are telling the truth or not, you never can tell. But that makes me actually wonder if Hillary wasn't necessarily hands-on involved in the murder, but and maybe was upset when it happened, but maybe knew that it had to happen. But again, that's why I go back. That's why I fall back in the book on the big question that's such an indictment on her is not that she did it, but that it's clear and obvious cover-up of a murder, and there's obvious terrible corruption in the cover-up of this murder, and she's never spoke out about it once. That's her great indictment.
Now, talk about how John Clark and Knowlton, because of their status, they were able to create their kind of own document that contradicted the Starr report. And how did that get put through the court system?
Well, the Office of Independent Counsel is basically the creature of Congress that is voted on to go investigate corrupt presidents. And so Congress appointed a 3-judge panel to oversee the Office of Independent Counsel. And they chose a judge named Ken Starr, actually a colleague of theirs on the Court of Appeals, to become the head of the Office of Independent Counsel. So it's known as the Starr investigation, the Starr report, but it's technically called the Office of Independent Counsel. And their job is to investigate thoroughly the matters that have been prescribed to them by Congress. And then when they're done, to write an exhaustive report on what happened. And so when the time came after, I don't know, what was it, 6 or 7 years of the Starr investigation, when it came time for him to write his report, he, it was I don't know how many pages, 300-400 page report. And they are required by law to send the extracts that are germane to various witnesses and people that appear in the report. They're required by law to send those summaries to them, and those witnesses and other people that are involved in the report have the opportunity to write their rebuttal or their response and send it to that 3-judge panel, and they can choose to include it at the end of the report as an appendix or not. And so Knowlton decided to do that. But he decided not to just make some comments about his own, aspects as a witness and what the Star report said, which wasn't not that much compared to the whole report about him. He didn't just report about that. He and John Clark and Hugh Turley decided to write an exhaustive 20-page summary of all the cover-up, all the faked evidence, all the falsifications, no x-rays by the coroner, all these lost photographs, 3 different guns, failure to check for any fingerprints, on and on and on it goes. Just all this corruption and all this documented corruption pretty much overturned everything else that was in the Star report itself. And so they went ahead and wrote that as their addendum and submitted it. And when Starr saw it, he was furious. He wrote personally a letter really imploring the judges not to allow that to go into the ultimate official report, because he didn't like it. And the judges discussed it amongst themselves. I've got the correspondence involved with it. And at the end of the day, they said, no, we're going to include it. One judge said he clearly refutes everything that Starr says in his report. I think we need to include it.
Those are like the highest powered. They were from the U.S. Court of Appeals, right? I mean, those are guys who are.
Yeah, I think it's right. Yeah, it's right below the Supreme Court.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think Scalia was at that same court. So they were the highest, level of the legal community of these guys making a decision to include the Knowlton Clark addendum,
Right.
So it's pretty incredible. And it's permanently part of the Star report, correct?
Permanently part of the record.
Yeah, it's part of the record. So
now, unfortunately, the Star report has gotten hijacked quite purposely, I would think, by Starr himself, but into a sex report. And so when everybody thinks about the Starr investigation, they think about Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky and, cigars and all sorts of,
Have you read the footnotes? Have you read the footnotes? The footnotes of the Star report?
Yeah, I read the whole dang thing.
Yeah, their footnotes are pretty kinky, man. It gets pretty.
Oh yeah, no, I read it all. Yeah. I read it all. But
I had a buddy of mine who interned at Plato Kacharis's office. He was Monica Lewinsky's lawyer, right off Connecticut. So I was around a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, anyway, so the Star report has come to be known as that sex report, but it's really broader. It deals with Whitewater and it deals with the Foster investigation, that sort of thing. And so now, when you Google Star report, you get a paperback book that has a picture of Monica Lewinsky on it, and right. and it's an abridged thing that just talks about the sexcapades. It doesn't even include anything that has to do with Vince Foster or the Knowlton addendum or anything. So, the Ministry of Truth, the Orwellian Ministry of Truth, has done a good job after the fact to make sure that not too much of this gets out.
Just minimized, and pretty much all of the Clark Knowlton information was pretty much ignored by the mass media. Is that correct?
Yeah, it really was. Other than Ambrose Evans Pritchard early on, and I can't think of who else really gave them a lot of press. But when they won the whole thing about their appendix going on the Star report, they contacted 100 different news agencies to tell them the news, and not a one of them reported it.
Yeah, the only one I remember was Mike Rivero. What really happened was that was pretty much it from my memory of people who were reporting. There were maybe some smaller alternative media people who were onto it, but definitely the underground grapevine was very aware of Vince Foster. You know, I think that even my friends in the legal community, everybody kind of knew something about it. So it just didn't get any publicity, which is, you know, remarkable. Although people are still talking about it today, which is, you know, in light of what's happening in DC and Hillary's, 70 days from stealing the White House, it's still relevant.
Yeah, and just to plug my book real quick, if you go to Amazon and just put Hillary and Vince in the search engine, my book will come up. And it's a quick read. You know, like you said, you read the whole thing last night. I wrote it. My kind of what I bring to the table is I use story structure for nonfiction. So I take a story like this and I use character and plot and protagonists and antagonists and rising stakes and, you know, all the plot points that are necessary to weave a very interesting story. I use all that in nonfiction, so it makes for a really good read. So
I agree. It was a great book. I really enjoyed reading it. It's very clear, easy to grasp some of the complexities of, you know, what was happening at that time.
Yeah, so it's really worth reading, and so I encourage people to buy it.
Is there anywhere else they can get it? Do you have a website, or is it just on Amazon?
I just have it on Amazon. You don't like to support Amazon?
I do. If sometimes, like I know for myself, I like to sell my books through my website because I get a better return, better margin than what Amazon does. But all my books are on Amazon.
Yeah, well, actually, no, I hear that. I've published many books, self-published several books, and published books for a lot of people. And you know, I looked at the numbers for Amazon Kindle and Create Space, and you know, after the cost of printing, the cost of pre-press, the cost of postage, and everything like that, it's really not a bad deal. And so
it's pretty easy. 70%.
Yeah, so I'm not in that situation where if you were to buy it directly off my website, I'd make a whole lot more money. I'm pretty pleased with this with how they do it. It's only $5.88 on if you buy a Kindle version of it, and I think it's like a $10.99 if you buy the paperback version.
Cool.
And both pretty reasonable prices, and it really is a good read. So I encourage people to do it.
What other books have you written?
I wrote a book called America's Trail of Tears, which is about the Cherokee removal west. Kind of got Andrew Jackson as a bit of an antagonist in that one. And I wrote a book about my hometown, Chattanooga, Tennessee, called Old Money, New South, The Spirit of Chattanooga, which is about the billionaire Coca-Cola bottling barons who've run the town for 150 years. That one's sold very well and has kind of taken the town by storm. I've got this one. I've got a movie script that I wrote that hasn't been made yet called The Wizard and the Lion. Yeah, it's about...
that sounds fascinating.
Yeah, C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien were best friends. They had a falling out later in life. And,
was that the Green Dragon or something like that? The pub that used to hang out at?
The Bird and the Baby, I think they called it.
Bird and the Baby. Oh, I got the wrong one.
The Bird and the Baby, Eagle and the Child, I think was its official name, and they nicknamed it the Bird and the Baby.
Gotcha.
Anyway, so I've got that. I got an endorsement for the Oxford C.S. Lewis Society on that script, but it hasn't been made yet. So things like that, and I've ghostwritten books for several people.
Cool. Well, Dean Arnold, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. It's been very informative. Again, the title of the book is Hillary and Vince, A Story of Love, Death, and Cover-Up by Dean Arnold. Get it at Amazon. I highly recommend this book. Dean Arnold, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, William. I've enjoyed it.
All right. Take care.
I'll see you. Bye-bye.